Welcome to the latest in our series here, funded by the Templeton Foundation, on theology, cooperation, and game theoretical approaches to evolutionary biology. I'm very delighted to welcome Friedrich Lohmann here today. He is a young German systematic theologian, and in Germany that means also an expert in theological ethics, who has a special interest in foundational theology and ethics. He studied theology in a number of places in Germany, at Marburg, Erlangen, Heidelberg, before taking his doctorate, which is a fine book on the influence of neo-Kantianism on the theology of Karl Barth, at Mainz in 1997, from which he took a position teaching at Tübingen, where he worked on his Habilitationsschrift, which was gained in 2001, which was on questions of natural law and human rights. He's recently been a fellow at the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton, where I first met him, and where he's been working on a project on self-interest and morality. And as soon as I heard that this was his latest interest, I invited him to come to be part of this series. So we're very glad to welcome Friedrich Lohmann today to talk to us on self-interest, morality, and cooperation. Friedrich.
Thank you for this warm welcoming. I'm very glad and also very much honored to speak to you today, and I'm looking forward to your comments on my paper. And I'm not sure if I make it for the 50 minutes which are left until 6 o'clock, so perhaps I will do some minutes more, but we'll see. So you see the topic of my talk: self-interest, morality, and cooperation. Last year, one day in September, my attention was caught by a news headline on the internet. It was some days after the south of the United States had been struck by the Hurricane Katrina, and the headline that captivated my attention said something like, "Actor Sean Penn criticized for selfish rescue effort." Am I loud enough? It's okay? Okay. You might say that in those days, many things happened that were much more important than Sean Penn's awkward rescue effort for Katrina victims. And you are right. Nevertheless, as an ethicist working on questions of selfishness, you see the world a bit differently than others. And so I clicked on the headline to get some further information. As you may remember, Sean Penn had chartered a boat to save inhabitants of New Orleans from their flooded houses. There he is. Soon after the photo documenting his efforts had been released, suspicions were raised. Weren't there other things to do than taking a photo? Had he brought his personal photographer with him? What about the trendy and expensive jacket he was wearing? Was the whole thing a huge propaganda effort? Even after Sean Penn had declared his sole altruistic motives on the TV, the discussion did not stop. I was not interested in the real motives of this rescue action. What struck me was the reaction of those who criticized it. The result was not in question. Several dozens of people saved, some of them praising the actor publicly for his philanthropy. What was in question were the motives behind the rescue effort. And for many people, the positive result was completely tainted, if not annihilated, by the suspicion that a self-interested strategy was the leading motive behind all that apparent charity. For them, the suspicion of hidden selfishness was sufficient to change the moral worth of Sean Penn's action into negative. This leads me right away to my topic: self-interest, morality, and cooperation. No doubt that the case in question was a case of cooperation, given that help is just a special kind of cooperation with an urgent need and no direct reciprocity involved. But many doubts about the moral worth of this act of cooperation were generated once the spirit of self-interest motivation lingered around. I come back later to the deeper reasons of the contempt Sean Penn was confronted with. For the moment, I'd like to turn your attention to the opposite case, to human actions where no self-interest at all seems to be involved. It is not difficult to find examples. The newspapers report risky rescue efforts and other acts of unselfish cooperation almost on a daily basis, praising the persons who put the well-being of others in first place. Some of these acts have become part of the collective memory of humanity. Take the case of the priest Maximilian Kolbe, who literally offered his life in exchange for an innocent Polish family father who, in an act of collective punishment, had randomly been chosen to be executed in the Auschwitz concentration camp. One cannot deny the purely altruistic motivation behind Kolbe's act of self-sacrificing cooperation. There was no self-interest involved, no reciprocity, and no kinship. Even the search for post-mortal glory can be excluded as a motive, given that it was not sure at all whether there were people present who would survive and report Kolbe's sacrifice. And yet, this humble attitude is, paradoxically, just a main reason for the admiration everyone had and still has for this unassuming priest. Once again, as in the preceding example, I do not want to comment further on Kolbe's act. It is sufficient for the moment to think about the moral acclaim it gets from people in the past and present. I contend that the two examples, and all the others I could mention in the same sense, say much about something like a common sense with regard to the moral worth of human actions. There seems to be a broad agreement among us fellow humans in thinking that the moral worth of an action is tainted by self-interested motives and raised by the lack of them. Or to put it in another way, the less self-interested the motivation, the higher the moral value. This seems to be true for all human actions, including acts of cooperation, at least in the common sense. In my lecture today, I intend to reflect further on this judgment of the common sense. If ethics begins with the common sense, it should not end with it. As we all know, widely shared moral intuitions are sometimes wrong. And if they are right, it is still worthwhile to understand them better. Ethics is, and here I think to be in accordance with many others, ethics is a critical and constructive reflection upon widely shared moral intuitions. Today, my intention is to focus particularly on the question of cooperation. What makes an act of cooperation morally valuable? What has self-interest to do or not to do with it? The first half of my lecture will be devoted to these questions. In the second half, special attention will be given to empirical research on human cooperation that has been done recently in the behavioral sciences. What can be said about notions like reciprocal altruism, strong reciprocity, and inequity aversion if we compare the respective attitudes with the moral point of view on cooperation as it will be sketched in the first part? So we have first part, moral point of view, and second will be models of cooperation. You find all this also on your handout. The result of this comparison will be ambiguous. The aforementioned empirical research establishes an interest in reciprocity as the predominant motive for entering in cooperation and maintaining it. This attitude falls short of the self-transcending universal scope as it characterizes moral excellence. The research on strong reciprocity and inequity aversion shows, however, that human beings do not act as selfishly as suggested for a long time. With regard to many of them, rationality cannot be restricted to a pure means of accumulating individual advantages, but has a social component that implies to forego personal interests and even to accept deliberately negative individual payoffs in cooperation. Although the recent empirical results confirm that a morality of rational egoism is quite frequent, they indicate at the same time that a considerable part of the population has social preferences too. Their interest in reciprocity places them somewhere in between selfishness and morality. I contend at the end of my lecture that the recent overcoming of the self-interest hypothesis in the behavioral sciences merits highest attention by the normative sciences. The gap between what humans ought to do and what they actually want to do seems not to be that wide. This result is encouraging for any approach to ethics which claims that a moral conduct is not opposed to the natural inclinations of individual human beings, but their true fulfillment. This is, as you can suggest, my approach. Of course, there are other people saying that finally ethics has always to be against the natural inclinations. I will try to explain at the end also why I think this is not the right approach. I would like to finish this introduction with some words on the relationship between morality and religion. First of all, a remark on method. Some of you might be surprised that the following considerations are free of almost any explicit reference to religious language, let alone explicit reference to the Bible or another religious source. You might take them, therefore, more than a philosophical, than a theological piece. This understanding is not completely wrong. In my view, faith and reason are not opposed, but complementary. This implies that all contents of belief can be expressed in a neutral, reasonable language. They even should be handled in this way to make possible a critical and constructive dialogue with other interpretations of human reality. The underlying presupposition when engaging in such a dialogue is that both sides can learn from one another. The classical approach of faith seeking understanding means exactly this. Far from being a pure repetition of what has been written, the belief in God needs a constant contextualization in search for inward understanding and not outward authoritarian obedience. The gospel preached and performed by Jesus is full of reasonable transgressions in this sense, leading beyond the pure letter of the law. Such a contextualization can draw positively upon other sources than those with an explicit religious label. It is in this spirit that I refer mainly to Kant's ethics in the following sections. I take the Kantian notions of autonomy and universal concern to be in accordance with the best interpretations of morality that can be found in the Christian tradition. Those who are familiar with the current discussions about the foundations of Christian morality will notice that my approach is as far as possible from a so-called ethics of divine command. The partial reference to Kant does, of course, not mean that I approve the whole of Kant's ethics. It is out of question to replace one kind of authoritarianism by another one. One of Kant's contentions I do not agree with brings me directly to the relationship between religion and morality that I have announced. Kant, as is well known, approves religion only insofar as it supports morality. In this, he is in accordance with those who claim nowadays a revival of religion out of the presumption that religious commitments bring about good behavior. Such a presumption is, however, not only empirically mistaken, given that religious zeal alone is all but an unambiguous foundation for moral behavior. It presupposes also a very restricted picture of religion. Every religion is a comprehensive worldview and should not be reduced to a moral code. Things get even worse when God is introduced solely as a superior instance whose task consists in the sanctioning of human behavior, either positive by reward or negative by punishment. Religion can bring about a moral code, but it is first of all a way of interpretation and not a way of conduct. The Christian religion can motivate to do the good, but its main motivational notions are fullness of life and justification and not reward and punishment. Moreover, concerning the religion of Christianity, it has to be acknowledged that throughout most of its history, theologians have contended a common knowledge of the essentials of morality, known as natural law. Already the Apostle Paul claims, in accordance with his Jewish forebears, that the moral law was written in everyone's heart by our common Creator. Therefore, other than explicit religious sources of morality have to be acknowledged, and a reasonable approach to ethical questions imposes itself. This was all the introduction to explain a bit my standpoint, my approach, from which I will now argue. So I come now to the first part, the moral point of view, and the first section of it is named 3 Types of Goodness and Cooperation. If we want to know the features of a morally valuable cooperation, we first need to know what the distinctive feature of moral actions and attitudes is in general. The first and intuitive answer to this question is simple. It's the following: moral actions are good actions. Things are, however, not that easy. It can be shown by a simple analysis of our ordinary language that we use the word good in 3 different significations. They have in common that they refer to a sort of excellence, but there are obviously different types of excellence that need to be distinguished. The first one can be called technical excellence. It refers to the fact that something corresponds well to the aim it is intended for. In this sense, a good chair is a chair that allows excellent seating. The same technical evaluation can be applied to human actions. If it is my aim to come as soon as possible from one place to the other, the best action in a technical perspective will be to use the quickest means of transportation. If I want to eat good food, I will have to choose the best restaurant. This notion of goodness seems to be clear, but it has, however, its limitations. Technical goodness compares outcome and intention, but it remains silent on the question whether the intention which underlies an action is good or not. Take the example of robbery. In the technical sense, the excellence of an action of robbery will be proportionate to the excellence of the prey. In some cases, it might even be better to kill the victim to avoid discovery and prosecution. It is, however, evident that the perfect murder or robbery, in the technical sense, are far from being good in the moral sense. The quality in terms of morality is in these cases rather reversely proportionate to the technical quality of the perpetration. This is due to the intention of the robber, which renders the whole action morally bad. And a perfect, cold-blooded robbery is usually interpreted as a result of a particularly bad intention. Therefore, moral and technical goodness have to be distinguished. They have, however, something in common. This common trait can be called objectivity. Moral and technical perspective evaluate different aspects of an action, intention or outcome, but they both take an objective standpoint. In the case of transportation, the technically best choice can be made following objective criteria. Arguably, the best advisor concerning the quickest way from A to B will be a computer. The same is true for perfect robbery. Back in the 60s, even Scotland Yard admitted that the train robbery performed by Ronald Biggs and his mates was a technical masterpiece. On the other hand, when we consider the moral perspective, we can also observe a certain objectivity. All of us make moral statements, and most of us would say that they make these statements according to criteria that go beyond their personal interests and arbitrary moods. A moral statement is not just a statement of taste. Likewise, it does not judge actions according to the possible benefits I might get from them. A moral statement tries to be impartial and therefore objective. In this, moral and technical goodness are different from a third type of goodness, which I would like to call self-centered goodness. It presupposes, contrary to technical and moral goodness, a deliberately subjective standpoint. An action can have technical flaws and moral failures, but it can nevertheless be good for me, because it gives me a benefit. A self-centered robber would speak of a good job once he was successful, notwithstanding the technical and moral worth of his perpetration. The customer, with a merely self-interested standpoint, will evaluate a restaurant positively if he likes the food, independently of the stars this restaurant has in the Guide Michelin, and independently of the way the manager treats his employees, which would otherwise be a reason for moral indignation. These examples show, however, the limits of the self-centered notion of goodness. Goodness becomes literally a question of taste when it is measured by the amount of personal benefit. Different persons will have different notions of benefit. This is evident in the case of robbery, in which the benefit of the robber increases with the loss of the victim. Concerning food, nobody can doubt that different ideas of the good for me exist. They are, interestingly, not only dependent on different tastes, but also on the extent to which moral and technical criteria influence the notion of the good for me. A conscientious person would have no benefit of the best tasting food if he finds out that the employees of the restaurant are treated badly. Someone else would not care. These ambiguities of self-centered goodness are, of course, the result of its subjectivity. A judgment according to moral goodness measures, first of all, intentions. It is not free of subjective and personal presuppositions due to the fact that every judgment is embedded in a personal worldview. It is, however, marked at least by a striving for objectivity and impartiality. One cannot dispute questions of taste, but one can dispute questions of morality. And we do it all along, thus assuming a notion of goodness which transcends questions of technical excellence and personal benefit. I am going to develop further the concrete meaning of moral goodness in the next section. But before doing this, I would like to point out that the three different notions of goodness I have sketched so far have to be distinguished also with regard to the special topic of my paper, the question of cooperation. First of all, it should be emphasized that cooperation is not morally good in itself. Cooperation can be good or bad, and its evaluation differs considerably following the underlying criteria of goodness. Technically speaking, the cooperation in a gang of robbers can be very good, whereas it would be judged very negatively from a moral point of view. Self-centered goodness can be attributed to cases of only so-called cooperation in which the common project is an illusion, because one of the partners only pretends to cooperate in order to more successfully achieve his selfish goal, a cheating cooperation, if you like. The result will be one-sided in this case, but the one who makes use of this cooperation will be pleased by it. The moral evaluation of cooperative actions differs, as for all kinds of actions, from the technical and self-centered judgment. This intermediary conclusion leads me to the next section, which will tackle the specific feature of the moral point of view more in detail. Given the fact that the technical aspect is rather easily distinguishable, I am going to focus particularly on the difference between the good in a moral and in a self-centered perspective. In the theoretical sense, the question of the essence of morality is a task of philosophical and theological ethics. Many people have answered it explicitly, and a common response has been dominating throughout the centuries, stating that the distinctive feature of moral actions and attitudes is their universal scope. I'll try to explain what this means by referring to Immanuel Kant. His way to put the moral law is well known. Act in a way that the personal orientation of your will could always and at the same time be the principle of a universal lawmaker. So you have here the word universal, and it's the change of perspective. You, the person addressed here by Kant, you take the role of a universal lawmaker. This is the initial idea of Kant with his imperative. Ken Binmore has contended that this formula is simply a grandiloquent rendering of the folk wisdom which says that it is immoral to lay oneself open to my mother's favorite reproach. Suppose everybody behaved like that. Binmore wants to say with his statement, which is, by the way, itself quite grandiloquent, that Kant's moral philosophy is nothing more than a gigantic air bubble, repeating in difficult style what each child learns as maternal wisdom. Suppose everybody behaved like that. I do not think that Kant would have been insulted by such a criticism, what was perhaps the purpose of Binmore. He never wanted to reinvent morality. Actually, such a purpose would be rather presumptuous. One can quote here the German philosopher Robert Spähmann, who once said in the preface of one of his books on ethics that he hopes to say nothing new on the following pages. After 3,000 years of thinking about how human beings should lead their lives, a reinvention of morality would be rather suspicious, Spähmann contends. Kant would have said the same. He does not want to make tabula rasa with existing models of human conduct. He only wants to put the intuitive knowledge everyone carries in her heart on a more solid basis. Suppose everybody behaved like that. Ken Binmore is right in underlining the parallels between this popular advice and Kant's categorical imperative. In particular, the folk wisdom contains, albeit inexplicit, the notion of universality, which is the key to morality according to Kant. Put yourself in the perspective of someone who has to establish a law which is supposed to be valid for all human beings together. The problem with Kant's formulation is not its simplicity, but its formality. As we know, people have quite different ideas about what a universal lawmaker should decide according to their different worldviews. The case of Adolf Eichmann, who thought the killing of the Jews was in accordance with Kant's moral law, is just an extreme example of the possible misuse. Kant underlines that, rightly understood, his moral law is free of ambiguities. This seems to be too optimistic, but at least we find a self-interpretation in Kant's groundwork which narrows the scope of misuse considerably. Actually, Kant gives there three variations of the categorical imperative. The variation, which is particularly important, renders the moral law as follows. Act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. This formulation is important because it fills the somehow hollow notion of universality with more substance. It makes clear that the universal perspective is that of equal respect regarding each human being. The notion of a common humanity, which I share with each other human being, obliges me to treat her or him in the same way I want to be treated, as an end in myself. Each human being has an innate dignity, and it is a moral exigency to respect this dignity. This implies to renounce to any calculation of benefit with regard to others, because that would mean to treat them as a pure means, instrumentally, without the respect one expects to be treated with oneself. One of the examples Kant gives in the groundwork for such an immoral, disrespectful mistreatment is lying and cheating just because one wants to maximize one's own profit. Don't use someone else as a pure means in the pursuit of your own purposes. Kant's notion of universality, understood as equal respect regarding each human being, does certainly not resolve all problems of concrete application. It rather sets a limit beyond which human conduct and attitudes cannot pretend any longer to be in accordance with morality. This limit is transgressed once egoistic self-interest becomes predominant over against the shared interests of humanity, standing for the good, which has to be pursued as an end in itself. Once again, this Kantian insight is nothing new. It is deeply rooted in a common intuition of how we should treat one another. Here's the place to come back to the ambiguities of Sean Penn's rescue effort. For the criticism he had to face was due just to this deeply rooted idea of good or bad human conduct. If he had had strategic motives in constructing a good reputation, he would have treated the Katrina victims as pure means to his own benefit. And what is interesting is the fact that the only suspicion of such an instrumental use was sufficient to cast a dark shadow on his action, without regard to the concrete result. Morality does not demand to act against one's own interests, but it demands to transcend short-sighted material interests in favor of a deeper understanding of one's own humanity, shared with others in a world of equals. The self is not neglected here, but it is seen from a higher, universal, and egalitarian perspective. We can speak of self-interest in the true sense of the word and distinguish it from selfishness, which is defined by a narrowed and egoistic perspective, by a motivation which strives mainly for one's own benefit. If we go, after this excursion into Kant, back to our initial question of cooperation, we now can state more precisely the particular feature of a morally good cooperation. It was said above that the moral perspective judges intentions and not outcomes, and that it is marked by a striving for objectivity and impartiality. We now can add to this the criteria which are applied in a moral judgment: unconditional and universal concern, perspective of equality. Therefore, a morally good cooperative action must be marked by an intention of the involved persons, which is, firstly, driven by a self-transcending move of unconditional and universal concern, and secondly, driven by an attitude which takes the partners as equals and not as means in the pursuit of one's own benefit. The question that comes up at this point is whether acts of cooperation that are also driven by self-interest can still be approved from the moral point of view. Presumably, the Sean Penn case belongs to this category. There were certainly ambiguous motivations in his case present. Kant is very severe in questioning the moral worth of this type of cooperation. Even philanthropy, he says, loses its moral worth if it is not rooted entirely in the respect of the moral law, but in other motivational sources as well. We should, however, distinguish this type of morally ambiguous cooperation clearly from the cooperation in a gang of robbers and from one-sided strategic actions in which other regard is completely missing.
Can I still pursue my own benefit if I take the other as equal?
So this would say an attitude which takes the partners, or you can leave out as equals, an attitude which takes the partners not as means in the pursuit of one's own benefit. So the pursuit of one's own benefit is refers to not as means.
Of course, we want only have means. Right. You can use others as means as long as they're not here.
Okay.
And we're using you as means for this lecture.
Yeah.
But if I have the pursuit of my own benefit, then it can never be a morally good corporate action. That's my question.
As he has pointed out, I would say, so Kant would be very strict here in saying, once there is any interest in personal benefit, the action does not merit moral worth. I would say what is important is what is the main reason for doing this. I would say if we regard things realistically, we have to say that always some kind of self-interest can be found in any action we are doing, and if it's just the only interest in continuing to live. So, and I think Kant can also be read in this way, but he makes also some very strong contentions in the other sense. But I would say at least if there is a predominant selfishness in this way of predominant interest in one's own benefit, the moral worth is at least reduced. And the ideal moral action would be the action which has only in mind this interest in the whole of humanity. Okay, let's now get back to the lecture, and I would like to make a short resume. I started with the common sense opinion on cooperation, which seems to indicate that the moral value of an act of cooperation is reversely proportionate to the amount of self-interest served by the action. Moral excellence, in this view, is characterized by an orientation against self-interest. In the second step, I have thrown more light on the essence of morality in order to examine this common sense opinion. I have distinguished three types of goodness and cooperation, applying respectively a technical, self-centered, and moral perspective. Following Kant, I have then tried to establish the attitude of universal concern for all human beings as equals, as the hallmark of morality. Let me say again that the choice of Kant was to a certain extent arbitrary. It is a common notion in philosophical and religious ethics, all through the ages, that morality consists essentially in an attitude of stepping back from the all-too human temptation to act according to the immediate voice of self-interest. To step back from immediate self-concern does not mean self-renouncement or sacrifice à tout prix. At this point, the common sense opinion of morality needs to be corrected, because it does not take into account the complex structure of the human self. We have seen that even Kant makes a well-measured self-concern a moral duty, despite the fact that he is certainly one of the most critical thinkers concerning self-regard in human history. It is not self-renouncement, but the move of self-transcendence, which is constitutive of morality. A perspective taking the self as part of a broader context and being therefore capable of criticizing too egoistic inclinations. If we adopt this complex and positive vision of the self, morality no longer means to act against self-interest. The example of Maximilian Kolbe, taken as a blueprint for morality, would be misleading. Morality can imply sacrifices, but it is not defined by them. Morality is much about balancing, and it might be, after reflection, that the own interests outweigh those of other people. What is necessary is just this move of impartial reflection, initiated by a step back from predominant egoism. This is the test for all actions, and so I want now to submit, I'm now going to submit to this test some models of cooperation as they have been put forward recently in the behavioral sciences. Given that these models refer to empirical evidence, we can put the question also this way: how many Kantians exist out there? During the last decades, the phenomenon of cooperation among humans has received growing attention by the behavioral sciences. The underlying problem is easily understandable. The theory of evolution interprets life on Earth as a pitiless struggle for survival. In this struggle, everyone is surrounded by natural competitors, if not enemies. An egoistic and ruthless attitude seems to be the most suitable under such conditions. But experience and empirical evidence show that this is not true. Cooperation is an essential part of human reality, with many individuals accepting, if necessary, serious disadvantages for the sake of the partner or partners. Given that this radical form of cooperation, also known as altruism, needs the most of explanation, it is not surprising that research has been largely focused on it. We find two main hypotheses in the sociobiological literature. The first one speaks of kin altruism. Altruism is restricted to individuals of the same kin. According to this point of view, the main interest of the individual is not its own survival, but the survival of the own gene pool, which is assured also by the survival of other members of the same family. In this way, the acceptance of disadvantages and even self-sacrifices can be explained if they are performed in favor of an individual of the same family. The problem with this hypothesis lies in the evident fact that people cooperate not only with their kin. That's the reason why the second hypothesis has dominated research on human cooperation during the last decades. Its short formula is reciprocal altruism. It takes reciprocity to be the key factor in cooperation. Otherwise said, cooperation is done for the sake of mutual advantage. Over the years, 3 different types have been analyzed: direct, indirect, and strong reciprocity. Direct reciprocity is given, as the name suggests, whenever two parties engage in cooperation with one another directly, with each side intending to get somehow its own investments back. This is a very simple form of cooperation, nothing else than an exchange. It was well known already in antiquity, as we can see in Latin sayings like "one hand washes the other," or "I give so that you give." Indirect reciprocity is given when 3 or more parties are involved. Its simplest variation has the form of a ring. Person A helps B, B helps C, and C helps A. But the term of indirect reciprocity is also applied if the ring is incomplete. Yet the missing link in the chain of exchange makes an explanation much more difficult. It seems that there are 2 possibilities of interpretation. Either we say that a person who helps without being helped herself is misdirected, which is just a more polite word for stating that C acts irrationally. Or we are obliged to question the model of rational human behavior that identifies rationality and pursuit of personal benefit. The problem is just with reciprocal altruism that it seems that there are also cases of cooperation in which no self-interest is involved. In the most evident cases of self-sacrifice. The alternative between rationality, between a changed view on rationality or a declaring of human behavior as irrational, is also present when it comes to the interpretation of other cases of cooperation, those that have caused behavioral scientists recently to coin a third type of cooperation, of reciprocity, strong reciprocity. It is the most complex form and also the most interesting for an ethical analysis. Therefore, I am going to focus on it more in detail. We can understand what is at stake when we have a look on what happens in a typical real-life situation. Person A offers person B cooperation to more or less unequal conditions. Let's say, for instance, that A wants to keep the most part of the benefit for himself. In this case, person B would still make a benefit, by accepting the offer, she would have more in her pocket than if she renounces to cooperate. However, many people in position B decide to decline the offer. Such real-life situations can easily be simulated and analyzed in experiments. The case I have described is known as the ultimatum game. Volunteers are assigned to be either proposers or responders. One proposer plays with one responder. The proposer gets a certain amount of money, real money, and can decide himself how much of it he wants to share with the responder. He makes an offer. If it is accepted, both can take home their share. If the offer is turned down, the whole amount of money is lost. This game and other related games have been played around the world, and the result is quite similar, independently of the economic and cultural context of the players. There is a relatively high percentage of offers close to a 50-50 ratio, and those proposers who make offers beneath a certain threshold risk strongly to be rejected. Such offers and rejections are in contradiction to a model of conduct driven alone by self-interest. So the game experiments show free riders are punished at personal cost, if necessary. Thus, the aforementioned alternative comes up again. Do strong reciprocators act irrationally, or do we need to change the individualistic view of rationality? Among the researchers involved, the second option has found growing support. The empirical results have over the years led them to a change in the perception of human conduct, which can be called, without exaggeration, a paradigm shift. There seems to be a natural striving for reciprocal and not one-sided cooperation that is so strong that it is able to dominate even the force of self-interest. Thus, the name, strong reciprocity. Strong reciprocity is not as innocent as the label may suggest. First of all, we have to understand that we reach with this term another level of talk about reciprocity. Strong reciprocity is not just a formal description of how cooperation is structured, but refers to a substantial quality of the cooperators themselves, to an attitude. A second feature of the strong reciprocity hypothesis is much more important. Ernst Fehr and his collaborators from Zurich University, who have pioneered this hypothesis since the 90s, emphasize in many of their publications that the evidence for strong reciprocity brings about a revolution in the anthropological ideas underlying economic science. For centuries, economists have built their theories on the self-interest hypothesis, which presumes that all human thinking and acting is driven by the pursuit of personal well-being. Many others, including philosophers, psychologists and biologists, have shared this hypothesis. Now, strong reciprocity is taken to be another driving force, thus explaining the fact that human beings are ready to forego the fulfillment of personal advantages in certain cases. The self-interested Homo economicus is thus, at least partially, replaced by Homo reciprocans. Although many people still have to be considered as selfish persons, an important number of human beings do not fit in the narrow box of benefit maximization. Human rationality, instead of being limited to questions of efficiency, gets a broader scope, embracing fairness considerations too. The models of neither kin altruism nor reciprocal altruism in the usual sense, which find, in spite of their names, the root of human cooperation not in other regard, but in the pursuit of long-term self-interest, do correspond to the empirical data. Let's take a closer look on the assumption that human beings are strong reciprocators. Those who make this assumption in a recently published programmatic volume distinguish two complementary parts in the attitude of strong reciprocity. And I refer here to the book which was published just a year ago, Moral Sentiments and Material Interests, the Foundations of Cooperation in Economic Life. And we have just on the bottom the name of Ernst Fehr, the Swiss economist who is, in my view, at the very beginning of all this research on strong reciprocity. The definition given in this book runs as follows. Strong reciprocity is a predisposition to cooperate with others and to punish, at personal cost if necessary, those who violate the norms of cooperation, even when it is implausible to expect that these costs will be recovered at a later date. We see then that we have two notions. One is costly punishment. I prefer the term costly punishment to altruistic punishment, which is mostly used by this group. And then the second factor is conditional cooperation. Both characteristics are equally important to distinguish strong reciprocity from two other types of preference, namely selfishness and unconditional altruism. If we establish a scale reaching from selfishness to unconditional altruism, strong reciprocity will be located somewhere in between the two well-known extremes. I have here some critical remarks. This time, the problem I will mention is not that it is empirically not proven, the hypothesis, but this time I really go ahead with the moral point of view, with the moral criticism, if you want. And my criticism is centered on the notion of reciprocity. The notion of reciprocity has become quite popular in philosophical and theological ethics during the last decades. It has without doubt its merits, and it corresponds well to the way in which human behavior actually unfolds. But if it's taken as the determining principle of human cooperation, certain problems occur, especially if we analyze it from a moral point of view in applying the universality criterion. The objection I would like to raise first is that not all human relationship is symmetrical. The starting conditions each person enjoys in life are unfortunately very different. It would therefore be simply inhumane to require the capacity to a symmetrical contribution as the primordial condition for membership in the community of strong reciprocators. Of course, one could say that strong reciprocators are able to make a distinction between willing and unwilling lack of cooperation among their partners. They would punish only those who are willingly free riders, which could be proven either by own experience or by reputation. However, such a distinction is difficult to maintain in daily life once the notion of conditions is introduced at the basis of cooperation. Kant was very straightforward in rejecting any notion of conditional cooperation under humans. All interaction dependent on other criteria than the inner value of a person gives this person a price instead of an unconditional dignity, he said. The notion of an economic exchange calculating prices and benefits, which is predominant in the notion of reciprocal altruism, is indeed still present in strong reciprocity. It presupposes a merchant-like relationship between individuals and has insofar a blind spot concerning complicated structures in which individual contributions are difficult to measure. Moreover, a strong reciprocator is more concerned about the possible disadvantages of cooperation for him than about the possible advantages of cooperation for others. That's why the feeling of revenge is associated with strong reciprocity, whereas help for the least well-off is out of scope. Self-concern predominates other concern. In all this, the universal scope is missing. I come to a fourth type of cooperation, also from Ernst Fehr and his collaborators. It's called inequity aversion. The definition runs as follows. An individual is inequity averse if he dislikes outcomes that are perceived as inequitable. The difference to the attitude of strong reciprocity is slight but important. The concern for reciprocity can be interpreted as a concern for equality. This is a trait it has in common with the attitude of inequity aversion. However, as has been said above, reciprocity conveys the notions of symmetry and exchange. This is not the case with inequity aversion. In a recent contribution, Fehr and Fischbacher discuss the attitude of inequity aversion. They acknowledge a broad similarity in the behavior of reciprocal and inequity-averse persons. The difference consists in the fact that inequity-averse persons also want to decrease the other person's payoffs when these payoffs exceed the equitable level. In other words, they struggle against inequalities even when these seem to be well merited, a case in which a strong reciprocator would not feel uncomfortable. Conversely, the behavior of an inequity-averse person is often not distinguishable from the behavior of subjects who help the least well-off in a general manner without searching for reciprocity. In the light of these differences, it is interesting to note that Fehr and his cooperators have coined the term inequity aversion in the end of the 90s, whereas the focus on strong reciprocity is more recent. The reason for this shift is quite simple, at least in my interpretation. According to recent evidence, strong reciprocity, this is a quotation, is the quantitatively more important motive. Quote, end of quote. There are just more strong reciprocators than inequity-averse persons in the population, and, as empirical economists, Fehr and Fischbacher model their theory of human conduct according to the empirical evidence they have. The problem, so, with inequity aversion, this time again from the empirical standpoint, is that it is just not very frequent. There are, however, at least some persons whose attitude in cooperation is mainly driven by inequity aversion. This is noteworthy because the attitude of inequity aversion comes close to the concern for universal equality I have portrayed in the first two parts of this lecture. Much closer than a conduct according to strong reciprocity, which remains in the framework of an economic vision of human cooperation based on the notions of merit, benefit, and exchange. To reach a real universal scope with regard to inequity aversion, we would just need to replace the too narrow reference to outcomes by an aversion against inequitable situations in general. The new definition would then say an inequity-averse person dislikes inequitable situations. She cooperates and punishes to promote equality. Therefore, inequity aversion is an unconditional preference. And this leads me to the last candidate to be discussed here, unconditional altruism as a possible attitude underlying human cooperation. Fehr and Fischbacher, in their aforementioned publication, take it into account briefly, but reject it as a relevant source of cooperation because people in their experiments are, on the one hand, much more inclined towards conditional cooperation and show, on the other hand, a strong inclination towards punishing, whereas unconditional altruists, according to the definition, do not punish at all because they know only a positive concern for their partners in life. I would say that the last aspect is not quite correct because we can imagine people that are unconditional altruists and, however, ready to punish. Let's take an example of friends. It can happen that friends punish each other. For example, one of them is chronically out of time and then the other leaves the appointment just to punish him. This would be a sort of punishment, however, in a relationship of unconditional friendship. But I don't want to go further here in this, and I come now. So just the slide. So this corresponds to the moral point of view, and the problem would be that it is almost inexistent. So this notion of almost inexistent leads me now to my last point, morality and human nature, or empirical facts and normative values. In the preceding sections, I have referred to different models of human cooperation as they are suggested by the behavioral sciences. All these models have in common that they are based on an empirical approach to human behavior. They want to describe what the determining features of human cooperation are and not what they should be. The empirical perspective is deliberately separated from the normative perspective as it is applied by ethics. This is a well-known fact, and Kant, for instance, has clearly acknowledged the difference between his moral perspective and an empirical description. Thus he says in his Metaphysics of Morals, quote, "So it is not a question here of ends the human being does adopt in keeping with the sensible impulses of his nature, but of objects of free choice under its laws, which he ought to make his ends." So you have just the difference between what actually happens and what ought to happen. Given these different perspectives related to an empirical and a normative approach, a behavioral scientist could easily raise the following objection to my attempt of comparison and evaluation. You are perhaps right from a moral point of view, but it is simply not our question whether the attitude of strong reciprocity is inhumane or not. We just describe what people are doing in our experiments. This objection is fundamental. It makes a point that concerns not only questions of human cooperation, but our current scientific culture in general, given that the barrier and the mutual misunderstanding between descriptive and normative approaches to the scientific explanation of life and world seem to be still growing, in spite of all laudable interdisciplinary efforts, as here in Harvard. So we could call this objection the objection of fact-value dichotomy. There are 3 replies I have prepared to this. I will just go through them to shorten a bit my manuscript, which has still 4 pages, and I don't want to be too long. So the first thing would be, this can be shown in the debates under game theorists, especially between Ken Binmore and the FAIR group, that finally they come back to the question of the origins of the altruism which they can observe. And then there is a difference in between if this is a sort of natural genetic disposition or if it is just a cultural achievement. This would be the position of Ken Binmore, who says finally all human beings are self-interested. So, and finally it's only by culture that they adopt also notions like costly punishment. Whereas the FAIR group, as I have referred to it, says this is a social preference which is part of the human being. They speak of not alone of a genetic disposition, but they speak of a genetic cultural co-evolution. So there is at least a bit of genetic part in it. What I want to say here is just that these debates cannot be decided on an empirical thing, because you can't play the ultimatum game with an Australopithecus. So you have just the remains, and you can only guess how people in the past have perhaps behaved. So, but there is some speculation about the origins. So this is one point to say that the fact-value dichotomy is not so clear as it is supposed, for example, by Ken Binmore. You have his quotation on the handout. He has said, in questions of human cooperation, the psychological laboratory is the final court of appeal. This seems to be not right, already if we take this question of origins, where he is very involved in. The second point would be that in all these games, you have the so-called experimenter effects. So these games are not in any case a complete picture of human reality, because the subjects, they know that this is an experiment, so they behave perhaps otherwise than they would behave in their true life. And of course there is once again a value argument inside which decides to which extent this experimenter effect is taken seriously or not. And the last point would be that you can find also in the behavioral scientists a tendency to deduce a social policy from empirical data. And of course, to come to political consequences of these empirical data says in itself that you leave the only description perspective. But you go further, and I think this is right, you go further also to take moral conclusions out of the empirical data. This would be the response to the question human nature versus normative values, which comes from a positivist standpoint, because you could say the fact-value dichotomy, to say we can really distinguish between fact and value statements, this is the typical positivistic statement. But you can have more or less the related criticism also from the other side, from the side of the normative sciences and of religion. In this case, the argument would be that the good is in any case strange to human nature, and in the Christian perspective you would say it is strange especially to human nature because it is sinful. I have already in the beginning said that this is not my position, but now I will also deliver the arguments I have against this point of view. The first point I would like to make is that ethics would be self-defeating if really you say that there is no clue in human nature for any of these normative values or rules. If there were no concern for the other somehow engraved in human nature, all talk about universality would be nothing more than just talk. And the morality based on it would be a cold, heteronomous law. Then we have another argument. This is a quotation taken from Kant, once again and for a last time. Kant discusses the question of true friendship. So in this case, a friendship where no interest in mutual advantage is involved. And he asked himself, is this real something that exists, or is it a sole fantasy or an idea just without any relationship to the true human nature? And Kant takes the example of a black swan, and he says, finally, a black swan exists here and there. So these cases of true moral behavior are rare, but you can find them here and there. And this would be another argument to say that the good, in the sense I have pictured it here, is not so strange to human nature as it is suggested by some people. And the last point is that, also if we are now coming more to the Christian point of view, that sin has to be taken as a corruption of human nature and not as a complete transformation, changing completely the human character. There was a discussion going on in the first decades after the Reformation in the Lutheran camp about this question, and one of these Lutheran theologians made this his standpoint, that really now sin is the nature of the human being and has completely replaced the good nature from creation and after the fall. But this notion was rejected, and so Protestant theologians, you can take Luther, Melanchthon or Calvin or any other, have all maintained a notion of sin which makes it a very grave corruption, but however maintains a core of the human being which is accessible for the good and for God. It is true that the empirical research I have referred to demonstrates that the way human beings actually cooperate indeed does largely not correspond to the idea of a moral attitude. Strong reciprocity, let alone reciprocal altruism, is not morally perfect. However, the fact that the conduct-shaping existence of such social preferences has been claimed recently by behavioral scientists is encouraging for the ethicist in a twofold manner. First of all, the swan of morality and universal concern she sees flying above human daily busyness appears to be not as black and imaginary as that. And secondly, the gap between the two scientific communities of empirical and normative researchers seems to be a bit smaller than before. I suggest to apply the notion of similarity in difference as a formula for the interhuman relationship. You can apply it to the interhuman relationship, but you can also apply it to the question of the encounter of different scientific cultures. Normative and empirical researchers work on a common project, the deeper understanding of life and world, and they are different persons. They are similar persons, but they employ different approaches. Mutual interest and respect is thus an attitude that should characterize interhuman and interscientific cooperation as well. I would be glad if my lecture could contribute a bit to the promotion of this attitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Friedrich. We've gone on a little longer in the lecture than we usually do, but I think we could take 2 or 3 questions and finish well before 6:30. And we do have microphones available for people who wish to ask questions. People asking questions might like to say who they are, since Friedrich is a visitor and doesn't really know anybody here.
Christy.
No.
Can anyone hear me?
No.
Anyone now? Is that okay? I'll try to speak pretty loudly. I was inspired by your Katrina example because there's a group of people here who have been doing some post-Katrina work just about a month ago in Mississippi. And after our experience, we've been circulating a lot of emails to reflect on the experience. And one member of our group submitted an email that her uncle received apparently immediately after Katrina hit that reported an example that I've come to think of as the thwarted altruist or the tragic altruist. It was a guy who went to a big sports stadium in Houston with the intent of volunteering. And the way he described it was he said he wanted to go there and get his warm fuzzies, by which he meant a sort of disparaging term for some sort of emotional gratification, and went on to describe his experience there. And the thing that he focused on again and again, in addition to the race of the people that he was trying to help, and it was obvious that he was just a profound racist and very deeply to the core, but the experience that he kept coming back to was that there wasn't gratitude on the part of the recipients. And based on the models that you put forth here, it would seem that he was a type of strong reciprocity person, and that gratitude, expressions of gratitude, were the particular kind of reciprocity that he expected to get. And I guess the question that I wonder here is, are these models, do they proceed from kin altruism through unconditional altruism in a sort of order? And is there a way of seeing what happened to this man as being stopped in some sense between strong reciprocity and either inequity, aversion, he didn't seem to be concerned with that, or unconditional altruism? And I guess the other aspect of it was in the disparaging reference to warm fuzzies. It almost seemed as if he understood that there was a model of pure altruism out there, and maybe even had a foreshadowing that he would fall short. But yet it was out there, and he seemed to know it. And I wondered at times if there was a virtue ethic that needed to supplement his deontological understanding of what he thought he was there to do, that might have allowed him to actually do it.
Yes, I think this is a good example that things in reality are not as easy as you can present it from a theoretical standpoint. I would have problems to say this is clearly this or this type of cooperation he has practiced. There's certainly a big amount of unconditional altruism in him because, first of all, he has gone there. So there was not, first of all, something he received and then he went. So he did the first step to go there. And then it's the question, how do you evaluate this search for some gratitude or getting something back from people? It was finally, he was not expecting the same amount that he gave, just perhaps a sign of gratitude. And I think this is legitimate, and it's deep rooted also in our human being that we look for this. So I would say this is an example of, from the moral point of view I have had in mind here, it's quite a high example. I would not, of course he falls short of certain things, but the question is who falls not short of this. So I have presented the Kolbe example as a really glaring example of someone who sacrifices his whole life. But I also said in my lecture, if you take this as a blueprint for morality, you can only end in despair. And what then happens is that people like him do nothing at all. And this is worse than other things. I also have told to people as I said, I don't know really the motives of Sean Penn, but let's say that he had some selfish interests behind, that he wanted to build up a good reputation. You still can say that he did more than many other wealthy people did. So I would also there, and this is why I also ventilated here my disagreement with Kant, who says if there's just a small portion of self-interest or of interest and gratitude in it, it has no moral worth at all. I wouldn't agree with this. So we should not be too severe with each other.
Strong reciprocity is based on punishment. And I have a problem using punishment as a mechanism for cooperation. And the reason is the following. The way how it is normally done in strong reciprocity is that you and I, we interact, and I tell you, unless you cooperate, I will punish you. And now you analyze the situation and you choose it is actually better for you to cooperate in order to escape the cost of punishment. But logically, what is missing here is that you should then say back to me, hang on, if you punish me, I will punish you back. And that destroys the mechanism completely. And basically then we have to agree to cooperate, in a sense, we cooperate such that we will not punish each other. And then we have to ask, where does this agreement, this cooperation come from? And this is usually either direct reciprocity or indirect reciprocity, or kin selection or group selection. So in my opinion, punishment does not lead to cooperation. If it does lead to cooperation, it's actually one of the traditional mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. I have said that I have, at least concerning the religious aspects of morality, also my problems with punishment. I think this is also psychologically proven that if you want to incite someone to good behavior, you should not do it with punishment. But on the other hand, you say there should be another level of communication, if I understand rightly, that you say you should at least warn the other person before you begin to punish.
Yes, you can, yes.
But this is, however, what happens in these games, at least when they are played over a long time. So I think what is the result of the ultimatum game, for example, where there is the possibility to punish for the responder, is that the proposer only allows himself once to give nothing, because then he knows, finally I go out also with nothing. So then, because the other can communicate, I will punish you, and actually he punishes him once, then he knows at once, okay, I can't go with this, so I have to come more and more to a 50-50 ratio. So I would say punishment can be, actual punishment also can have this aspect of a warning. And punishment, I wouldn't say that punishment is at all not in agreement with ethics. So I have shortly mentioned the example of punishment under friends. So there is also what counts finally is the attention behind the punishment. Is it because I want to help also this friend or not? And this was my criticism to what they say about strong reciprocity, or is it just a notion of revenge? Because I feel badly treated, and so I say, okay, if I get out here only with $2 out of 10, then the other one should have nothing also, because this is the best. And this is, of course, finally the end of cooperation. There we agree.
I'm not yet, I'm not yet clear about your conclusions in the following way. And of course, I will lift up Schleiermacher's critique of Kant's second critique to ask my question. Schleiermacher argued that there are both normative as well as empirical data that have to be taken into account in order to have an ethical standpoint. And thus, as he demonstrated repeatedly, there are universals, but yet at the same time, coming from the laws of reason, but yet at the same time, you have to take into account the empirical constrictions upon a person based upon her or his upbringing, including thus the capacity of the person to reason in certain ways. Thus, Schleiermacher argued against Kant that Kant had fallen away from his own insights in his second critique. Thus, I wonder, I'm not clear whether you are maintaining what would seem to be a false dichotomy between empirical and normative research with regard to ethics, or if you're simply arguing for a more nuanced link and conversation between the two. I'm not yet clear of your position.
The last one would be my position. So what I have put here in questions is just what I don't agree with, and these are the counter arguments I give. I would also say that in Kant there is the risk to take the empirical self as a notion in itself, and the moral self also for itself, and then there is no connection at all between the two. But just this phrase about the black swan shows that Kant finally is also interested in some empirical traces of the moral self. And so in this, I think he would agree with Schleiermacher in saying that finally you don't have reason alone, but you have always reason in nature, and you have nature in reason. But it's true that Kant, in many points, he takes a very extreme position. And so that is why I pointed out that I don't agree with everything Kant says. It was especially his notion of universality, and especially also the image of a universal lawmaker that I find very compelling. And this was the main reason why I have gone back to Kant.
This is actually also related to your answer to the. It's related to your answer to the first question. I'm a behavioral scientist. Dealing with this problem, you put a lot of focus on intention at the beginning, and in fact, most psychologists do that. So they define altruism according to the intention of the actor. This runs into problems if you're trying to look at other species, because you get hung up with the intention of vampire bats and stuff like that. I think it works from a biological point of view to look at the act and its consequences to the recipient. And you started to get at that in your answer. So that even though the guy wanted certain kinds of warm fuzzies, he still did a useful thing. So if you move your definition of morality, or at least realize there's two different ways of looking at it. One is on the actor's intentions, one is on the consequences of the actor's act. You can have moral behavior, if you define it in consequences, with bad intentions, and vice versa. It's easiest when you restrict yourself to that range of behaviors where the intention matches the consequences. But it's more interesting also to look at the ones where they don't match. I think if I ran the zoo, that is, I set up the system of morality, I would definitely want to reward good intentions, which seems to be the sort of ethical approach. But I think there also needs to be room for rewarding good behavior, recognizing it as moral, even if it comes from non-altruistic intentions. And I don't know if there's some way for you to include that in your model.
Yes, it's certainly a point I have to look upon. I had even questions to myself when I put on the slide a moral standpoint regards intentions, because this is, of course, I would say also in some sort of criticism to Kant, that we have also to some extent also to look on the result of things. So the example he has, the guy who is asked to betray his friend, and he says, however, I don't lie to the police, I say that he's in my house. And this would be finally not a morally good action if he with this delivers his friend to death. But however, you could say, isn't this really only a question of consequences, or is it also a question which touches the intentions? Because in this case, the person who doesn't want to lie has, in my view, a wrong intention, because he puts his moral purity above the interests of his friend. So in this case, you could say, if he really considers his intentions and if he applies the moral point of view, he would come to another action insofar as he would have taken into account the consequences. But this is just I have many problems with the distinction between theological and deontological ethics. I think in practice you can't distinguish them like that. So you always need to reflect also about consequences when you make your when you apply your rules. And on the other hand, utilitarianism has also some very strict rules. One of them would be that pain has to be hindered. So this is a very strict principle for all utilitarians. So you can say there you have also a deontological element in them, and it's the same you can do with intentions and outcomes. But it's right that this slide was a bit too one-sided. Mm-hmm.
Maybe there isn't much time left, but if I could add just one last question, and then Tim add his at the same time, and you can answer both of them. Let's see how we go. Thank you for a wonderfully clear outline of how certain biological and economic accounts of ethical behavior prepares for, but doesn't fully fulfill what you would see as properly moral intentions. That's very, very helpful and clarifying. I find your position, though, somewhat paradoxical, because I'm not quite sure, given all the critiques you have given us of Kant's position, why you want merely to propose a Kantian position when you could also add to that a more robustly theological position. What space of discourse is it that you hope to persuade some of these economists and biologists to subscribe to Kantianism, and why are you stopping short of a fully theological position?
Sure. Partly I was going to respond to Martin, but I think relatedly maybe I still have questions on universality. One, do you think, as Kant evidently did, that all moral claims aim at universality? You know, I'm inclined to agree that many of them do, but I'm not sure that all of them do. There may be special obligations or even duties of charity that one wouldn't enjoy universally. But I think the more important second question for me is, can you really ground universality of respect on Kantian autonomy? Is that too rationalistic a basis precisely because some folks are not relevantly autonomous? Right? What do we do, in short, with people who don't have rational agency? Fetuses, babies, the mentally retarded, the senile. Can we use them as means only? Isn't Kant finally too rationalist to really give us a universal ethic of respect?
The two related questions.
Okay, I'll begin with the last one I have still in mind. Interestingly, there are Catholic ethicists in Germany who argue against abortion and against stem cell research, also with Kant. So you find in his work actually some passages where he takes the embryo more or less with the full rights every human being has. So I think he can be read in a sort of capacity approach to reason, so that you really must have the actual capacity to reason to be involved in this group of equals. But I'm not sure if this is really the case, because his argument against conditional cooperation would say that you just should not take, for example, the capacity to communicate as a condition, to take this person or this embryo as someone with dignity. So dignity is a very important concept for Kant. Of course, the question is, who is a rational person in his eyes? And there I think he is a bit ambiguous. You have passages where he is speaking more or less of people having really the capacity, but then you have also sort of potential arguments.
You have to use the language of potentiality at least.
And the other thing with if all moral statements must have a universal background, or if there are some special, I would say that you need, of course, to take into account the specific position you have. So you should not say in a certain case, do I want that everyone behaves like this? But you have to ask, do you want that everyone in this situation behaves like this? So once again, the example of lying. Usually you should not lie. But when you are in the specific situation that your friend, your friend's life depends on your lying, then I would say there's even a universal obligation in this case to lie. And of course there Kant once again is too abstract. At least in this example. He has other examples. He knows very well that, for example, amputations of body members can be necessary just to save the whole body. There, of course, you could also say this is finally deontologically not good to take away something of your body. But there he says also, if you have a higher telos, then it's possible. So your question, yes, why I didn't go further with a concrete theological position. Yes, so in any case, I didn't want to be here seen as a Kantian. So I have already said I have this aspect of universality, which is important in my view, and then also this aspect of dignity that is important in Kant, that human beings have no price, they have a dignity. And so you find very interesting things, and I can't find those in Christian ethics, I have to say. Of course, you can find, so in this clearness, for example, the quotation I have had, it's only in a footnote, where he says, when you have conditions before cooperating, you are treating the other as something, as a thing having a price, and not as something having worth in itself. And so with this, in this language, I don't find it. In the Christian tradition, I would say that of course you have the same intentions in the Christian tradition, but as I have said, I like to take also from those guys intentions or intuitions that seem to me just in the best sense to summarize what I want also to say as a theologian. But of course you can perhaps say I'm not enough theologically, but I don't know.
Dr. Lohmann, thank you very much for a very stimulating and architectonic account. We're very grateful to you indeed. Thank you. Mention those of you who are left, the very last in this series this year will come on Thursday, May the 4th, when Tim Jackson is giving his lecture on cooperation and altruism from a more Kierkegaardian love ethics perspective. Thank you. You never get that.